This is Michelle from Dasami Bookworm Podcast. And I am once again delighted to have Steve Logan as my guest. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Michelle. Good to be back.
Thank you very much. Well, we've had a great discussion about poetry, but we're going to take a little different tack today. We're going to be talking about your musical career, which has been quite long and varied. And as always, it's great to start at the beginning. So, where did your musical career start, Steve?
Well, according to my mother, it started in a cafe in Risca in the South Wales Valleys when I was 5. Um, she claims that I got up and started singing along to the jukebox. I subsequently wrote a song about that, or sort of about that, really about the fact that my mother discovered America through listening to American rock and roll, and I expect that that's what I was singing along to when I was singing with the jukebox. But my father was a club singer, so he used to sing in the Irish clubs around Newport. And although I wouldn't have understood anything, much about that stuff then, it was part of the emotional climate that I was growing up within. My mother and father, if they didn't meet at a gig, I think that they decided that they wanted to go out together at a gig because my mother saw my father singing, and shortly after that, they became an item. But my father used to whistle a lot, and he used to sing, and he taught me to whistle, and he gave me, before I had any proper instruments, and he gave me a set of plastic instruments when I was a kid. And from this, I think that I was forming the idea that music was a good thing, and it was something that he liked and he approved of. At the same time, I wasn't brought up by my mother and my father initially. I was with my guardians in Risca, and my guardians were my great aunt and great uncle. And my great aunt, Maggie, loved music, and she had a very agile, expressive voice, whether she was talking or singing, and she did quite a lot of both those. So I was used to hearing her say things like, "Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to stand up in front of an audience and thrill them?" So if you put together her enthusiasm for music and my father's, you begin to see that I was picking up the feeling pretty consistently that music was beautiful and that it excited people and that it was something that you could perform. Um, although I sang at school, like most kids do, or many kids in Wales did then, and although Welsh culture is renowned for its emphasis on singing, I didn't start to think of myself as a musician until a bit later. I begged my aunt and uncle for a guitar, but the first guitar that I got was always remembered as one of my great disappointments because it was plastic.
Oh,
My aunt and uncle didn't really know what to get, and so they got me this guitar out of a catalogue, I think, and I realized quite quickly that you couldn't learn to play on it. It had 4 nylon strings. Um, so I didn't at that stage learn to play guitar, but when I was 11 and sent to boarding school, against the wishes of my guardians, but I was sent anyhow, um, I I got a proper guitar. I got a Spanish guitar,
no.
which felt like a bit of an achievement because shortly after the plastic guitar instrument, my great aunt took me to a music teacher in Risca, So I would have been at that stage, I suppose, about 7, and asked this music teacher if she could teach me to play guitar. And I remember that there was a Spanish guitar leaning against the wall. And she asked me to hold out my hands. So I held out my hands, and I was always a small kid. So my hands were tiny. And she said, he won't be able to get his hands around the neck of the guitar. Of course, I didn't know then that Spanish guitars have wider necks than quite a lot of other guitars. So it was, of all the guitars that I could have been expected to learn on, it was the least suitable. And these days, parents have available to them half-size guitars and all sorts of small guitars, for people with small hands. So I learnt to play the piano instead. Not very well, but I learnt to play it after a fashion. And then I went to boarding school, and I got a Spanish guitar, and I began to learn. I think I had 2 or 3 lessons, but I didn't like them. So I learned how to, all I remember from these lessons was I learned how to play 3 chords. But I didn't like them because the teacher didn't have the habit, which is now customary among guitar teachers, of starting where I was and trying to teach me how to play a simple version of something that I wanted to play.
Right.
So I didn't bother with the lessons anymore, and I started teaching myself, and I was becoming more and more aware of music on the radio, on records. And when I was 14, I remember sitting at the back of the physics class and missing Wales a lot, I think, and feeling confused about where I was. And I wrote my first song at the back of the physics class, which was probably the best thing I got out of physics. um, and then shortly after that, I became aware that a couple of my contemporaries had formed a band, rock band, and they needed a drummer. So I decided that I would be the drummer. I didn't know how to play the drums, but I persuaded my mother to buy me a cheap drum kit, secondhand. And we got this installed in a room down by the gym where we used to go and practice. And we were in there practicing one late afternoon, and another friend of ours came by, whose name's Nigel Elliott. And he said to me, "Can I have a go on the drums?" I said, "Sure." So he sat down and started playing the drums, and I instantly realized that he had a knack for it.
Yes.
Which I don't think I did. But anyway, I didn't get a chance to find out because Nigel then took over the drumming and I sold him my drum kit. I, meanwhile, moved on to singing. So I became the singer in that band. And a few months later, we got our first gig, which, when we were all 15, and we played a support to a local rock band at the school dance. And that was my first proper experience of performing to an audience. So I think of that as really being the beginning.
With the story at the beginning of where the music was, what music were you drawn to and listened to that you feel inspired you for what you wanted to create yourself?
Well, in one way, it's easy to answer that question. In another way, it's hard because I've mentioned to you that my mother liked American rock and roll, and I was vaguely aware that she was listening to Elvis, and then my great aunt and my great uncle, who were my grandmother's generation, they liked a lot of older stuff, and I heard lots and lots of that on the radio. So I heard, lots of what I think of as like standards, the kind of songs that we now think of as um, composing the Great American Songbook. Songs by the Gershwin or the Berlin Brothers. And so I had those in the mix. And then when I was at school, we were listening to lots of heavy rock and progressive rock, and generally dissociating ourselves from the pop music market. And we thought of that all that as being very much more serious and enterprising and adventurous. And I began to get interested in this band called Free. And I think probably that was one of my very, very first, conscious musical enthusiasms, which would surface again later on.
I have a question. What was the first record that you ever purchased? Do you remember?
I remember the first records that I ever got. They were records that belonged to my mother. There was they were both singles. One of them was called Fabulous, and I couldn't pronounce it. She used to play this song on a little Dansette record player, and I couldn't say Fabulous. So I used to say something else, that was more or less like it, which she used to remind me of. And then the other song, which I remember more vividly, was called Last Train to San Fernando, which, has lingered in my sensibility ever since, because it's a song which sounds very happy, but, as the title implies, is about the danger of losing something. And the refrain in it is, if you miss this one, you'll never get another one. So because of my situation, that had quite an impact on me, because after all, when I went to boarding school, I, in a certain sense, lost my home with my guardians, and I lost my mother, although I saw both of them, in the holidays. So those were the first records that I was conscious of owning. But the first records that were like really mine they were my mother's. They were Beatles records.
Yes.
And then when I was at boarding school, because my interest in music was then becoming very pronounced and obvious, one summer holiday, I went home, and my mother had told me that she had this fantastic present for me, and I had no idea what it would be. And then we went into the sitting room of her flat, and there was a superb hi-fi system. I've always regretted the fact that she sold it later on,
Oh,
but anyway, it was a record player on a stand with two big speakers standing about 3 foot high. It really was unusually good for that time, and these speakers were in teak cabinets, so the
mm,
resonance was great. And she gave me two LPs, as they were called then,
yes.
on vinyl, and they were Led Zeppelin 1 and Led Zeppelin 2. And I played those two records inside out. And then later on, not very much later on, I got my first jobs. One of them was working at a butcher's, ironically, because I would soon become a vegetarian, and then much later a vegan, partly because of things that I saw at the butcher's. But when I was at the butcher's, because I got paid, I'd give my mother most of what I earned, but then I kept a bit of pocket money, and every week I bought an album. So I built up quite a big collection, which again, I absorbed very fully, and it was just as well that I had absorbed it because it got stolen. Someone broke into our flat and they took my records.
Oh
Obviously,
no.
obviously thought, yeah, this is a well curated collection here. Um, so all of that, was in the mix of music that I was listening to, and then when at the age of 16, I finally I got released from boarding school because I was finding it so difficult. I couldn't bear to be there anymore. And my mother realized that it was just impossible to keep me there. So I left the boarding school, and immediately after I left, myself and Nigel, the drummer, the guy that had bought my drum kit, who subsequently went on to become a professional drummer with Sheena Easton and Toya Wilcox.
Oh wow.
Um, yeah, Nigel and I then used to go busking, in the holidays. So we busked mostly in the Edgware Road, Marble Arch part of London, and we played all those underground systems, subway systems that were around there, and again got a lot of experience performing and choosing songs and coping with other buskers who are older and moved us on, and so that was really quite an important thing. And I'd left the boarding school completely, although I was still in touch with my old bandmates there, I was by that time at a comprehensive school in North London. And at the comprehensive school, I had one friend who was very interested in music, and we used to go and play acoustic guitar together. And I always remember him saying to me once, he said something about, oh, well, that wouldn't fit with your style. And I was far less bothered about the fact that he thought this song, which I was trying to play, wouldn't suit my style, than I was delighted that he thought I had a style at all. At that, yeah, at
You
that
can
moment, I
recognize
thought,
it yourself. Uh-huh.
yeah, so at that moment, I thought, oh, I'm starting to get on a bit on guitar, and I was still singing. I think I still went busking on my own. Um, but then then there was a sort of gap, and what subsequently happened was a bit strange. I went to university, so I didn't really expect to go to university because nobody that I knew had been. And although I'd been to boarding school, and people think that boarding schools are posh, what they don't know is that boarding schools are as varied as any other kind of school. And the one that I went to did not have a tradition of sending people to university. I only ever met one person there who went to university. And if you'd asked me when I left at 16 what I knew about university, the answer would have been nothing. Nothing. I wouldn't have had any conception of what it was. But when I was at the comprehensive school, I, I, I rather deliberately sabotaged my exams. But I learned a couple of things. One was I discovered George Orwell.
Ah,
And George Orwell was a very big deal to me then, and still is. I thought that I used to read these writers that we had to read, for English A level, and I used to think they had nothing to do with me. I was a valley boy. I was from the South Welsh working class, and then I'd read books by George Eliot, let's say, or Jane Austen, and they were clearly not addressed to the group of people that I thought of myself as belonging to. And yet, when I read George Orwell, I had the illusion that he must be working class. I thought he must be because he wrote about working class life, with such feeling. And it wasn't for a while that it wasn't until a while later that I discovered that he'd been to Eton, and that he described himself as lower upper middle class, that is upper middle class with no money. But he had this great feeling for the poor and working class, and he wrote prose that tried to make itself accessible to everybody and didn't give itself airs. And I loved that, and I still do. And I indeed on my current album, I've got a song called Orwell, which is about why he's meant so much to me, all this time. But I discovered Orwell, and I discovered contemporary poetry because we had an anthology that we were studying. It was called The New Poetry, edited by Alan Alvarez. And in that, I discovered R.S. Thomas, from Wales, Ted Hughes, DJ Enright, Sylvia Plath, Anne Stevenson, a lot of older, now very much older, contemporary poets. So those were my sort of important intellectual discoveries then. And then when I left there, I went to work. So I had a job in a public library. After I worked in a butcher's and after I worked in John Lewis, picking up cotton off the floor in the haberdashery section, I got this job in a library. And my girlfriend at the time was doing evening classes, and she was going to a place called the Working Man's College in Camden Town in London. And the Working Man's College, again, it was something that somebody from my, South Welsh socialist, nonconformist background, it was something that I was bound to approve of because it had been founded by rich and very privileged Victorian men to give something free to working people. So the whole thing about the Working Man's College originally was that the teachers who worked there did not get paid. They
Really?
had to be they had to be voluntary. So I had two fantastic. So anyway, my girlfriend was there, and when she told me what it was like, I got intrigued. And because I had the feeling that, the exam results I'd come away with somehow didn't represent my interests, I thought, well, maybe I can go back and I can do my English literature again. So I started going there in the evenings, and so I resat my exams, and I took the Oxford entrance exam, which is a great instrument of democratic freedom that Oxford, in my opinion, shamefully abolished, and Cambridge also had a similar thing, which Cambridge too abolished. It used to allow anyone from anywhere, regardless of what their academic background was, to take this exam, and if the people who marked it thought that they would be interesting to teach, then they got in. So I got into Oxford through taking that exam, and then entered a period of perplexity.
And perplexed is a perfect place to pause until the next part for Steve Logan and the music interview on Jasami Bookworm Podcast. As always, wishing you a sunny day.